Thank you so much for your stamina surviving this day. And I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to help close our conference day and celebrate this exhibition. And I do so by placing our admiration for these portraits in the exhibition in the larger context of the appreciation of Dutch portraits over time. The portrait is a unique and unstable genre, for it is both a document of an individual as well as an aesthetic work of art. Because of this, the value of these portraits changed dramatically over the centuries, the result of different types of individuals and institutions who commissioned, dealt, collected, wrote, and exhibited them. These ranged from their original patrons and owners through subsequent collectors and dealers on the market, to the texts written by academics and museum curators, and finally, specialized museum exhibitions, such as the one we're enjoying today. I begin my discussion of the portrait in what may be a surprising location. The ships and buildings of the Dutch East India Trading Company, created in 1602, which was the world's first formally listed corporation. This was the heart of a trading empire that brought to Amsterdam products from around the world: textiles, coffees, rare woods, salt, and sugar, precious spices like cinnamon from Sri Lanka, sugar from Brazil, coffee from Africa and Asia, and it engaged the world slave trade. In the process, the company made fortunes for investors, both large and small. At its height, the Dutch East India Company was the most valued company in the history of the world. It soon made Amsterdam the center of world commerce. Although disbanded in 1799, it was in its time, and remains in today's euros, the most valuable company, as I say, in the history of the world. According to the most recent Forbes magazine survey, the 6 most valuable companies today are Facebook, Berkshire Hathaway, Apple, the former Google company Alphabet, Microsoft, and Amazon. Together, they are worth 2.8 trillion euros. In comparison, at its height, the Dutch East India Company was worth, in today's currency, 6.6 trillion euros. All levels of society bought shares and could make money in the company. From the maid, fishmonger, banker, and simple tailor to the wealthiest merchants with investments around the globe. Spanning a broad spectrum of society, many of these individuals commissioned portraits, and collectively in staggering numbers. In 1660, the population of the country was 1.8 million, less than 4% of the current population of Spain. Yet it has been estimated that over the course of the 17th century, between 750,000 and 1.1 million portraits were produced. Surviving portraits and inventories indicate that the first painting a couple acquired, whatever their station in life, was often a portrait of themselves upon their marriage, whether they were prominent couples or more modest married pair. And while the popularity of different genres fluctuated over the course of the century, the demand for portraits remained constant and high. While in earlier periods and elsewhere in Europe, the occasional portrait had been created for well-connected private citizens, the prevailing portrait types and formats were few. Primarily the imposing full-length standing or seated figure created for the palaces of emperors, popes, and aristocrats. These images were fashioned to impress, to assert social dominance and political power. In contrast, portraits created for these Dutch citizens varied widely in format and subject. Created for urban homes to commemorate events in a private life, create memorials for descendants, and above all, to position themselves among their fellow citizens in the rough and tumble of a dramatically changing economic and social environment. Many of these, including those in the current exhibition, are remarkable for their color, narrative, and lively characterization. These portraits took a remarkable range of forms of individuals, families, public figures, and civic institutions. Their patrons and sitters spanned a broad social spectrum, from modest portraits commissioned from less skilled painters to portraits of the wealthiest members of society, commissioned portraits from painters such as Rembrandt, Frans Hals, and Bartholomeus van der Helst. The former might cost a few guilders, but some patrons paid as many as 500 guilders, the equivalent of 2 years' wages for a modest craftsman. Thanks to the research of our colleague Bas Dudok van Heel, we know that Bartholomeus van der Helst charged 1,400 guilders for this portrait of Admiral Reiklof van Guns and his family, today known only through this copy. This is about €635 in today's currency, and roughly 4 years' wages for a modest craftsman. It was notably more than the 1,200 guilders that Rembrandt received for the Night Watch, which was 4 times the size and included more than 3 times as many portraits. These portraits were primarily understood as documents of their sitters. The secretary to the stadhouder, Constantijn Huygens, in our exhibition, by Thomas de Keyser, asserted that, quote, "Portraits perform a noble work, necessary for our human needs, because through them, in a true sense, we do not die," unquote. Similarly, of this portrait, Humanist Theodorus Scrivelius by Frans Hals, historian Peter Scrivelius wrote, quote, "If perchance envious time should blot out his name and hide the man, his likeness may speak for him," unquote. But it was precisely this documentary quality, together with the good income made by a portrait painting, that led art theorist Karel van Mander to disparage portraits as a byway of art that distracted artists from painting history paintings, which was considered the more noble genre. For the first several generations, family portraits remained prized possessions, hung on living rooms and bedroom walls. While paintings in all other genres, history paintings, landscapes, genre painting, and still lifes, began to be bought and sold on the market, family portraits remained within the home precisely because they had no market value. Except for the rare portrait by a celebrated artist, there was little interest in portraits of other people's family members. To put it in personal terms, unless it was painted by a famous artist, and I had a well-developed taste for art, I would have no interest in buying a portrait of your great-grandfather. As family portraits were passed down from one generation to the next, the identities of these paintings of faces and figures became lost. Precisely as Petrus Scrivelius had predicted, envious time began blotting out the names of these sitters. Many of these portraits depict their subjects in sober black dress, enlivened only by a white linen collar, such as this magnificent pair of portraits by Rembrandt in the current exhibition. Because they had descended through the Van Beristain family in Delft, Many scholars originally thought they might depict Delft burgomaster Cornelius van Barsten and his second wife. A much more convincing identification of the couple as Thomas Brouwert and his wife Johanna van Merwede van Klootwijk, a collateral ancestor of the family, has been made by Rudy Eckhart in our exhibition catalog. In my own study of family inventories, I've repeatedly witnessed a portrait which originally held pride of place in a living or bedroom over the decades gradually be relegated to a back hall and finally an attic where it languished, to be damaged by time or man. It was this gradual disinterest by descendants in their ancestors' portraits which set the stage for these portraits' new lives. By the beginning of the 18th century, aristocratic households across Europe were amassing substantial painting collections. At the same time, a growing merchant class, particularly in England, France, and Germany, were also beginning to create rival collections. The buying of old master portraits had valence in England, for example, where owning a collection of portraits became increasingly important to one's social standing. For the most part, their values remained low, with one exception: portraits of historical figures and well-known men and women, particularly if they were by a well-known artist. Until the end of the 19th century, of these, Rembrandt's portraits were not much appreciated. Jean-Baptiste de Comp's, for example, biographical dictionary of Flemish, German, and Dutch painters of 1763 lists 10 portrait specialists in his much broader set of biographies of artists of all genres, where he wrote that Michel van Mierevelt, the artist of this portrait, is considered the most famous painter of portraits. While in 1798, English painter and author Joshua Reynolds opined that Bartholomeus van der Helft's Civic Guard portrait on the top as far exceeds my expectations as Rembrandt's Night Watch fell below it. Studies of the Dutch portrait at this time were driven by dealers and authors seeking to advise collectors. Their focus was upon attribution and the identities of sitters. Once Dutch portraits lost their original identities, they became available to be given new ones. And the pressure to identify a portrait with a famous artist and a famous sitter was strong. The first great survey of Dutch paintings was written by the London dealer John Smith, whose work created a canon of artists and attempted to sort out attributions. As a dealer, however, he and his sons recognized the difficulties of selling unidentified portraits. Smith's son put it this way in a letter to his father of 1842, quote, "You are aware of the difficulty attending the sale of portraits, even by the great Rembrandt, and at the price which we ought to reasonably expect for such an outlay, we shall not readily find an amateur or collector with the judgment and liberality to purchase paintings, however fine, of unknown individuals." This is vividly exemplified by a letter which the British ambassador to the Netherlands, Sir Charles Bagot, wrote to Smith about portraits in a forthcoming sale. He asked of this portrait, number 119, "Is this an authentic portrait and a good one in the bargain?" To which Smith replied, "I know nothing about the veracity of it being the portrait of Tromp, a Dutch admiral, but it is of first-rate excellence and worth 500 pounds. Of number 121, which we've seen before, Bagot noted, "The form of this picture," meaning the attractiveness of the lady, "seems to be against it. But it may be a brilliant head and everything by Rembrandt has charms for me. Smith agreed. A powerfully painted picture, but especially ugly old woman. And the rush to put out into the market paintings with notable identities had already begun. A London sale of 1832 gives a flavor of this rage. Over 2 days at 353 Oxford Street in London, an auction house sold the painting stock of a well-connected dealer, comprising 273 portraits. The title page of the sale boasts of portraits comprising specimens of nearly all the eminent artists who have flourished over time, embracing most of the characters who have adorned the pages of history. The identities attached to these paintings were hyped to such a degree that even contemporaries could be suspicious. One auction attendee wrote in his catalog with the judgment that the pictures were the property of Mr. Swaby, a dealer, and consist of an immense mass of rubbish with a few articles of value. Many of the names of painters and persons have been given at random. The rush was on to reattribute portraits to well-known artists and to re-identify sitters to famous people. I have traced 17 of these now, but I here present to you the critical fortunes of one well-known painting, which provides a particularly vivid example of several elements of the narrative. The interest in a painting by Rembrandt, late in the 18th century, when a famous name could be attached to it, and the identification as a portrait of what we now understand as a trony or character head, images of a head or a figure in half or three-quarter length. The bust of an old man in fanciful costume in the exhibition may be one such image. These tend to be picturesque, wizened old men and wrinkled old women, sometimes colorfully sporting breastplates and plumed hats, or exotic figures in old-fashioned dress, a costume that might bring to mind associations with Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or Asia. While some of these appear to be based on known models, most are not portraits in the sense we understand them today. Nonetheless, and you might follow the direction of my narrative, these could and were in later periods also misunderstood as portraits of actual living individuals. Head of an Old Woman, first mentioned in the 1639 inventory of King Charles I of England, as done by Rembrandt, an old woman with a great scarf upon her head with a peaked falling band. Sold after Charles was beheaded and recovered by his successor James II, it was listed in his inventory at Whitehall and still as an old woman with a veil over her head. Here's where things get interesting. The next inventory mentions that it was in Queen Anne's painting collection, made sometime before inventory made sometime before 1714, in which it had been moved to pride of place in the Queen's closet, or her collection of paintings at Windsor, and re-identified as the celebrated Irish Catherine Fitzgerald, Countess of Desmond, who was said to have died in 1604, a few days short of her 140th birthday. This was, incidentally, 2 years before Rembrandt was born. The Countess had figured in the popular imagination since at least the time of Sir Walter Raleigh, who mentioned that he had met her. She was said to have danced with Richard II, married at the time of Edward V, and you will notice that the inventors of this narrative have no sense of historical time. And after far outliving first her husband, and then the patience of the owner of the castle of which she had life use was thrown out on her ear. She then sailed, it was reported, from Cork in Ireland to Bristol and walked to London to plead her case before James I, pulling her invalid 90-year-old daughter in a cart behind her. She is said to have died at the age of 140 after falling from a cherry tree. Portraits of the Countess became very popular. At least 37 lots said to depict her were offered for sale at auction between 1691 and 1839, 9 of which were said to be by Rembrandt. I'll show you 6 here. One can imagine some courtier to the powerful Queen Anne thinking that the enigmatic but haunting painting must have represented some important old woman, and that the notable Countess of Desmond would appeal to the Queen. Although it was well known that Rembrandt never visited England, much less could have portrayed the old woman who died 2 years before his birth, the painting was still being exhibited as late as 1899 as the Countess. Meanwhile, falling in line with the penchant for finding family members in Rembrandt's painting, in 1883, Willem Bode changed her identity to Rembrandt's mother, an increasingly popular identity in 18th and early 19th century England. And I show you a graph of the numbers of paintings sold in each decade. She has today been returned to her original identity, an old woman, with the notation that she has been called the artist's mother, but now in quotation marks. With the rise of national museums, many portraits by unknown artists began to enter public collections. In his survey of painting in the Netherlands, published in 1858, French critic Théophile Thoré, writing under the pseudonym of W. Berger, noted that a substantial number of Netherlandish portraits in the Rijksmuseum, at the time housed in the Trippenhaus on the right, were of unknown subjects, and that nearly all of the roughly 40 paintings for which the artist was not known were portraits. While Bartholomeus van der Helst and even Michel van Mierveld had been more popular than Rembrandt in the 18th and into the 19th century, with the emergence of a taste for art of the people and the desire for a national icon, Rembrandt's reputation came to the fore. The first monographic exhibition devoted to any artist in the Netherlands was that devoted to Rembrandt in 1898. Of the 124 exhibited paintings, a full 87 were portraits and tronies, some well-known works and many no longer believed to be by the master. Notably, it was this exhibition that spurred the reevaluation of the attribution of Rembrandt paintings. With the 300th anniversary of Rembrandt's death in 1969, the question of the boundaries of Rembrandt's oeuvre came again to the fore, and the establishment of the Rembrandt Research Project and subsequent developments among scholars in Rembrandt attribution has been outlined today by Rudy Eckhart. Characteristically today, academic research and museum exhibitions go hand in hand. In the middle of the 20th century, a new methodological approach to Dutch painting was undertaken, which revolutionized the study of the portrait. Together with P.J. Vinken, Eddie de Jong published and examined a portrait by Frans Hals, focusing not on the painter, Frans Hals, or the sitters, Isaac Massa and Beatrix van der Laan, but upon the iconography of details of the painting. They demonstrated that the couple's love and devotion for each other was symbolized not only by the couple in the garden of love in the right background, but also ivy that clings to the tree and the nettles in the foreground. with a focus on the iconography of the portrait rather than the historical or social importance of the sitter or the fame of the artist. This approach opened up a much larger field of portraits of interest, which now included those depicting unknown sitters and by lesser-known artists. It was soon displayed in a groundbreaking exhibition at the Frans Hals Museum in Haarlem, Portraits of Marriage and Family in Netherlandish Art of the 17th Century, also curated by Eddie de Jong. Other exhibitions have provided a venue for original research in new areas, new methodological areas, including technical analysis. The groundbreaking monographic exhibition of the works of Michel van Miereveld, co-curated by Rudy Eckhart, examines Miereveld's studio, which is estimated to have produced, for example, more than 100 copies in various formats of the portraits of Prince Maurits. This exhibition provided, for the first time, insight into the artist's studio practice, specifically that the studio employed patterns to facilitate the production of similarly composed paintings. Important new understandings have also been made of Rembrandt's workshop practice, as we've seen today in the field of printmaking, as discussed by Leonore van Sloten. Finally, a study of costume in the work of Rembrandt and his contemporaries by Marieke de Winkel has provided another dimension to the study of portraiture, from iconographic interpretation to the role and value of dress among an individual's possessions. As is apparent from the exhibition catalog of our current exhibition, and we have experienced today, important contributions to the further study of the portrait, both painted and on paper, have been made by every colleague on this panel. Our academic researchers have in turn benefited from those studies of monographic volumes and individual artists in exhibitions. In spite of the new appreciation for Dutch portraits depicting a broad array of sitters by a wide range of artists, Rembrandt continues to dominate the field, and the current exhibition and conference is no exception. Of the 97 works exhibited here, nearly a full third are by the master. Now, I would be the first to celebrate Rembrandt as a great artist, but as this exhibition demonstrates, he had a large number of contemporaries who created magnificent portraits, which I urge you to return to the galleries and enjoy. Thank you very much.